And that's evident by the use of the symbols. To be taken literal. I want to go back and look at Daniel for a moment. We studied Daniel a while back, and Daniel plays a big role in the and more than one time, but in Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And what was that dream of? Big image, different parts of metal, and when Daniel interpreted the dream, he told Nebuchadnezzar, "You are this head of gold, and then behind you are going to be some other kings." Okay, there's going to be after you. There's going to be the Persians, the Medo-Persians, and then there's going to be the Greeks, which Greeks hadn't been really mentioned anywhere before. And then there's going to be the Romans. And in the days of these kings, the Romans, his kingdom would be set up. Well, why did he just say, have a dream that said, Nebuchadnezzar, after you is going to be four more kingdoms? So do we take that image as literal? About to fall over. Do we take that image as literal? That it was a real image? It was in his dream. Okay, it's a figurative thing. If you look over again in Daniel, in Daniel chapter 8, the vision of the ram and the goat, and he talks about he was lifted on the river Eliad. He lifted up his eyes and saw, there standing beside the river was a ram that had two horns. And the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher one came up last. And I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. Now, as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had the two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his two horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. And so we see this imagery of a ram and a goat. Were they literal? Was there actually a goat that came scooting across the earth? Well, what's the angel say? He says in verse 20, the ram which you saw having two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. In verse 20 and 21 of Daniel chapter 8. Why didn't it just, the image just say, oh, okay, here comes the Persians, here comes the Greeks. Why did he use that imagery? I don't know, but he used it. And it wasn't real. Okay? It was not literal. So why then do we want to go to the book of Revelation that draws from these kind of books and say we have to take it literal? When it's got all these beasts, these 10-headed beasts, all these crowns on them, all these, they got scorpion tails, and they're riding on a horse, and they're killing, they're killing a third of the ships in the ocean, and a third of this on the ground, and all that. Well, in the premillennial mind, that's all literal. And so what we have to decide is when I look at this book of Revelation, is it then in its own little world that all that imagery that John drew on. Now keep in mind, the writers of the New Testament, they were inspired by God, but were they controlled in word for word for word for what they wrote? No. They used their own style. That's why we look at different books and say, well, this is not the way Paul wrote. That's one of the big reasons why people say Paul probably wasn't the author of Hebrews. It doesn't fit his style, okay? And so each one of the Gospels are different. And they tell the same story sometimes in different ways. Just like, four of us see a wreck out here, and then they talk to the police. We may tell them the same thing, but in different ways. Well, the red car was coming that way, and the black car was pulling out. Or, yeah, the red car hit the black car. Or, yeah, I don't know what color they were, but one car hit the other one. Right? They're all different, but yet they're all saying the same thing. So we got to look at Revelation in that sense. And again, the most likely it was written around 95 AD, at the time of Domitian's persecutions, and those persecutions were considered continue until about 306, when Constantine he had the religious. He ordered the religious tolerance. He became a Christian. And Constantine, if you go into Israel today and you start looking around and you see all these churches built on all these sites, Constantine sent his mother around Israel to try to see if she, by interviewing different people and stuff like that, could pinpoint where these events took place. And when I said, well, she said, well, this was it. Well, they built a church on it, or church building on it, or whatever. And so Israel's just scattered with all these ridiculous-looking buildings, when what's really interesting is when you go to a place that's just the ruins, because you can get a feel for it. We went to Dan, we went to Caesarea, we went to Philippi, Caesarea Philippi. We went to all these places, and the least interesting to me was where they built the church on it. And one of the creepiest ones was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And that's supposed to be both the site of where Christ was crucified and buried. And but still, there's nothing that you can even use your imagination for. And so again, when we begin to look at these type of things, we've got to understand, again, go back. Again, Constantine allowed those persecutions to end, but that's almost 300 or 200 years more. And some of these persecutions were more severe than others. Some of the Caesars did not persecute Christians, but some of them were very extreme until the days of Constantine. And that's also the time when the Roman Empire was divided. Okay, and so again, depending on how you look at Revelation, was the beast and all this imagery, Rome and the Jews and the enemies of the Christians, or things that still have to take place. So when we look at the message of Revelation, it should first be understood in the eyes of the Christians to whom it was written. And that's true in any epistle, any letter that we write. Who was it written to? The overall theme for the saints at that time was that there would be eternal victory for those faithful in Christ, regardless of the suffering that's going on earth. And we'll see that in chapter 20. Okay? So that's just a little bit. I mean, I don't want to make this a class on Revelation, but we're going to be looking at the 1,000-year reign a little bit. We're going to be looking at the 144,000. We're going to be looking at the the two witnesses of Revelation chapter 11, because all of these play a part, a misunderstood part in my mind anyway, of the premillennial theory. And so as we delve a little bit more into these symbols coming from Revelation, I just want you to try to grasp in your mind how do you view the book. Okay? And so that's why I say maybe I don't completely understand every single aspect of this, but I believe I have to look at it on what it meant to those saints then, who were being killed. They were being beheaded. They were going through atrocities that we can't even imagine. And they're thinking probably in their mind, man, this church is about to go. You know, how's it going to survive against this humongous nation of Rome? And what was Rome to them? Rome was the world to them. Everything was Rome. And as we mentioned about their standard with the eagle, even the Jews despised that symbol because it carried a religious meaning to it. Okay? So there's so much, and when we can consider what the deity of, or the supposed deity of the emperors, we can see how that all developed. Any questions on any of or comments on these aspects of trying to understand Revelation? Because like I say, we're going to spend some time in it. And I want you to be able to understand why you believe one way or the other. There's a couple of comments that are made in some of the premillennial books that I read, even the premillennial commentaries. One is that the amillennialist by Tim LaHaye, that those of us who are, and I consider myself amillennial if you're going to attach millennial to anything, which means there's no 1,000-year reign, then Tim LaHaye said that the amillennialists were responsible for pushing the world into the Dark Ages because they tried to spiritualize everything. And that nothing was spiritualized. Well, read some of Paul's writings about things being spiritual. And then I read another one that said the amillennialists just choose to ignore all the prophetic signs. Okay? Prophetic signs where? In Daniel and Ezekiel and all. And so there's a list that I've given, and I read these to you a few weeks ago, some passages that speak of Old Testament prophecies being fulfilled. And so I gave you a list, and I've added one or two more to that. And all these are talking about that these Old Testament prophecies were fulfilled in Christ. Okay? So the question to ask then is, if these Old Testament prophecies have already been fulfilled in Christ, we cannot bring them into the times that we live today. Because if we do, it's going to give us a wrong understanding of the Scriptures. And so we've got to understand that these prophecies of Old Testament times all led to Christ, okay? Including Daniel. And to the end, remember when we were studying about Daniel, and it talked about that this is the time of the end. He didn't say the end of time. But over and over he says the time of the end. The time of the end of what? The time of the end of the Jewish way of life, which happened during AD 70, when Rome was destroyed. And that ended the Jewish way of life. Okay? Because the Jews today are not the Jews of the Bible. We're going to do a class on that too. But the Jews, after that destruction of Jerusalem, Jews have not been able to trace their lineage to any particular tribe. Robert?
Yeah.
I heard you were called Bobby.
Yeah, people do call me that. So your point there where everything is fulfilled in Christ, we're not saying Christ like death on the cross, that pinpoint. We're saying more first century, right? Because if you have Daniel, he describes the Roman Empire, which will eventually be destroyed by the rock, which is Christ. But that doesn't take place at Jesus' death. That takes place, I mean, I believe Revelation is discussing.
I believe like in Daniel, it stretches to the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And see, that's still tied into Christ.
Yeah, which I would agree.
So, yeah. And Mark 13 and Luke 21 talk about the same thing. You know, we talk about that with the idea of the kingdom and all. So when we begin to try to look at these scriptures, I want to at least get into this last paragraph I got. For Revelation 20 and 1 through 7 to teach all that the premillennialists claim, they must take Old Testament prophecies out of their intended meaning and add to the 1,000-year passage, in addition to adding other facets not found in the scriptures. I want to read a comment from, this is from Ray Summers. He wrote the book, Worthy is the Lamb. He was a professor at Baylor, not a Christian, in the sense that we look at a Christian. He was a member of the church. But one of the best, if you get hold of Worthy is the Lamb, to me it's one of the best reads on the book of Revelation there is. But I want to read something that he says about this passage. He's talking in this one about rival interpretations of this passage. And he said all these rival interpretations center around the millennium. This word means 1,000 and does not appear in the New Testament. It is derived from the term 1,000 years, which is used in this passage. Now listen to what he says here. If verses 4, 5, and 6 of Revelation 20 had been omitted, no one would have ever dreamed of a literal 1,000 years of Christ's reign upon this earth, his setting up a temporal throne in Jerusalem, and inaugurating a millennial reign as an earthly monarch. Yet whole systems of eschatology, theology, and philosophy of history have been constructed on this precarious basis of hallowed symbolic verses. And so this is the only place you see it. You don't see it anywhere else. Okay, so what's missing? Okay, and I'll list some of the things that are missing from this passage for the premillennialists. And that is no mention of the second coming of Christ in that passage. Nowhere does it mention that. But that's a big part of this premillennial theory. That what's going to happen, remember, is that after the rapture, there's going to be 7 years of tribulation, and then Christ is going to return back to earth at that time and set up his kingdom on earth. Okay? No discussion about that return of Christ in this passage. Nothing about the rapture there or anywhere else in the Bible, for that matter. A bodily resurrection is not mentioned anywhere in there, which is premillennial theory, and at the time refers to a bodily resurrection. Okay? Christ was reigning on earth. Nowhere in that passage does it mention Christ reigning on earth. Nowhere does it mention Jerusalem. Nowhere does it mention a throne in Jerusalem. And nowhere does it mention a return of the old law complete with Old Testament priests. All of those things have to be brought in from somewhere. Some of them come from Old Testament prophecies that are being taken out of context, and other ones are just, I guess, grabbed out of the air. And so understand that when we start looking at this, we need to be able to say, this is why. Now, the next section, we'll get into that next week. I've got a lot more scriptures that we're going to be looking at on the back page. I encourage you to read some of these scriptures that are in the back and talk a little bit more about that. And we'll get a little bit more into what that 1,000 years really is. And so, again, however you view it, what I'm teaching is my view of this, okay? And I understand that some people may have a different view of this. I'm glad for you to share it with me and for us to sit down and talk about it or whatever, but I cannot see anything literal about this, and I cannot see all the things that are supposed to happen in this 1,000-year reign on earth anywhere in this passage. And like Ray Summers said, if these passages weren't there, this probably never would have been here, but it's there. And so what I hope you learn through this study is for the premillennialists, they grab a lot of things from places that they're not, that's not what it's meant, and a lot of things that just don't make sense in my mind. Thank you.